to the website and I'll find the bio there. And trust me, trying to condense it to one page, it took me a few hours because I want to. So, but overall, John's work really aims to improve research methods and practice and to enhance approaches to integrating information and generating reliable evidence. And John is one of the most exciting colleagues and scientists around, and we're delighted to have him. He was actually born in New York. People may not know this, although he grew up in Greece. And right currently, he's at Stanford and moved there in 2010. And John has held a lot of leadership roles in many societies. He was actually he's the past president of the Association of American Physicians. He's currently the president of the Society for Research Synthesis Methodology. And he's been an editorial board member for many journals, including PLAS Medicine, Lancet, Annals of Internal Medicine, and many others. And he's also the past editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Clinical Investigation. You may not believe this, but John has actually given more than 700 invited and honorary lectures, which is incredible, and has been a recipient of many, many awards. The list is just long. Has also been inducted in many associations. Actually, I should mention, for those people who remember, we also gave him the Chanchalani Award here in Hamilton at one point. So John has also received many honorary degrees from several universities. And one of the reasons he's here is because we at McMaster feel incredibly honored to actually give him an honorary degree as one of us. So now we can claim it as a graduate from McMaster University. Yeah. Right. So one of John's paper, and people may know this, why most published research findings are false, has actually had more than 3 million hits. Any of us, if we get 100 hits, would be delighted. So you can imagine 3 million hits. It's quite something. But one of the things that really has kept me close to John is his humility and academic authenticity. Every time I've reached out to him to actually even come to talk to my classroom, he said yes. He's never said no, and he's been incredibly generous as a colleague to share, information and knowledge with others. And even when, we knew he was coming here, and we asked him if he could give this talk, he generously agreed. I know he had lots of things to do to prepare for this visit, but he's always incredibly generous with his time, and we're delighted to welcome him back to Hamilton. And we're looking forward to hearing from John. As always, it's always exciting. So you guys are in for a treat, and welcome back to Hamilton, John. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lehana. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back to the capital of evidence-based medicine. I feel like a pilgrim in a way, visiting McMaster. So I will present a few thoughts of mixing evidence-based approaches with meta research or research on research, how we could survey and improve our research practices. And I always want to start with a preemptive comment, because much of evidence-based medicine, of meta research, is critical appraisal, and being critical means that you criticize. People say, so you're criticizing science. Well, yes, science is the best thing that can happen to humans, but unfortunately, most scientific research is not using the best practices. It's using non-transparent, non-reproducible, suboptimal research practices. It's a massive enterprise. We're talking about more than 200 million papers, more than 30 million authors, more than 7 million papers added to that mix every year. Medicine and life sciences are about half of that. Most of that corpus is advertisements. It's a PDF that you have to trust. You cannot see the data, you cannot see the code, you cannot see the calculations in their details. And materials, algorithms are missing in the majority of papers. So the question is, can we do better with transparency, with reproducibility, with credibility, eventually, of what we do, what we publish, and what we read, and what we use? First of all, science is not a single enterprise. It is a whole universe. So this is a galaxy, a map of science that I work on drawing these maps with my colleague, Kevin Boyack. This map has about 500,000 subdisciplines, and each one of them has its own way of understanding and applying or misapplying the scientific method. It has its own strengths and its own weaknesses, and research practices vary a lot across that universe. What is also worse is that much, perhaps most, of that scientific universe may be unpublished dark matter and dark energy. Even for clinical trials, we know that maybe about half of them do not get published. If you look at all their outcomes, probably it's even less than half that are faithfully reported. And if you look at other designs that are not even expected to be registered and be as transparent, probably the rate is much higher. So in the universe, we know that, or we speculate that 5% of that is ordinary matter, 27% is dark matter, and 68% is dark energy. You can think an analogy of the scientific literature that probably we have a lot of dark matter and a lot of dark energy, which I would translate as incentives and conflicts and reasons to do or not do scientific research that are not necessarily aligned with getting to the truth or helping human beings or extending and improving lives. Even if single fields improve over time, the total universe may actually get worse if these parts that are dark grow faster compared to the parts that are luminous. And reproducible fields are many nowadays, or fields that people are sensitized to reproducibility, but also there's lots of fields where massive literature is being produced in total darkness. And that includes increasingly new ways, new galaxies within that universe. For example, we have paper mill galaxies that can generate hundreds of thousands probably of papers that are entirely fake, entirely dark. There are some common features across that universe. One such feature, for example, is that most scientists, especially in all of these fields, which is probably the majority that use statistics for inferences, they seek to get statistically significant results. This is some text mining exercise that we published many years ago in JAMA. We looked at the entire PubMed abstracts and full text articles that were available. Whenever p-values were available in the abstract, 96% of the time, they had statistical significance. Whenever p-values were in the full text, 96% of these papers had some statistically significant results. So statistical significance has become a boring nuisance. It has hardly any discriminating ability the way that it is run at the moment, at least at the levels of 0.05 p-values that are the dominant threshold. And we have many surveys of the literature that we benefit from the availability of large numbers of meta-analyses that have been done, where we can probe with different bias metrics, whether there's publication selection bias. And of course, you cannot be definitive about a single meta-analysis. All of these tests are indicators, are not proof. But when you look at the whole field, you get a sense of how it operates en masse. So medicine, environmental sciences, psychology, economics, where we have many meta-analyses that we have assessed, we see a huge proportion of significant results that are not justified. Most likely, most of them reflect selective reporting, either the old classic type of file drawer bias, publication bias, or probably more commonly selective reporting of outcomes and of analysis. And this is looking at the posterior probability of an effect being present once you adjust for that bias. And you see that in all of these fields, there's probably a lot of such bias operating. Another closer look here at economics, along with Stefan Bruntz and colleagues, we have estimated that probably 50 to 70% of economics is selectively reported. So, the vast majority of the literature. This is not a steady state that is just going to be like that forever. I think that we need an observatory of research in large scale to see how things are evolving. For example, it could be that in some fields, after some interventions are made in how designs are set and how studies are run and how they're published, maybe we see less of that bias. For example, we have done that exercise updating the results to very recently in fields like reproductive medicine. And we do see that there is a decrease in the number of significant results, perhaps more prominently in the area of clinical trials. Probably a lot of attention has been moved into trying to improve the reporting of clinical trials, and maybe that will pay off. Moreover, it could be that new norms may arise. For example, last year, I published that paper on inverse publication reporting bias, meaning that in some settings and in some fields, there may be a preference for null, negative, non-significant results rather than quote unquote positive results. And some examples, studies of toxicity and harm. The sponsor may not want to see significant results, that an intervention is harmful. Non-inferiority studies that are becoming more common. I think when I was a medical student, non-inferiority was something that few people were aware of, and very few such trials were happening. Now non-inferiority designs are fully legitimate and fully popular in many fields, and regulators are happy with them, sponsors are happy with them. So getting a non-significant result is perfectly fine. It's actually the goal in that setting. And reproducibility checks, people like me who want to prove that everything is wrong. If I try to reproduce a popular study and I find a non-significant result, I'm very happy with that. So I'm biased to give you a non-significant reading of a literature that perhaps it should not be as negative. We can map bias across scientific fields using large-scale evidence that has been accumulating through the efforts of all these evidence syntheses that have happened over the last decades. Along with Dan Fanelli and Rodrigo Costas, we used about 250,000 studies in about 3,000 meta-analyses across every type of scientific field, about 300 meta-analyses from each major field. And we try to see if the patterns in these meta-analyses are consistent, compatible with any of these 18 different types of biases. Small study effect means that small studies give stronger effects than larger studies. Gray literature bias means that gray literature gives more conservative results compared to the rest of the literature. Decline effect, the first study finds a very strong signal, and then subsequent studies, the signal is washed away gradually. Early extremes, or what I call the Proteus phenomenon, you see a first study showing a very strong signal very quickly because this seems to be exciting and surprising and people want to be contrarian. You see a study in the complete opposite direction or with no effect, and then the other studies fall somewhere in the middle and so forth. So if we have meta-analysis, we can see whether the results are compatible with these patterns. And we can see whether they vary across different scientific fields. And most of these patterns are seen across most scientific fields. But there are differences. For example, small study effects are very common in the social sciences and pretty prominent. They're common and prominent in the biomedical sciences. They don't seem to be a problem in the physical sciences. Perhaps physical sciences like astrophysics with all these huge telescopes and huge collections of observations, where the problem is not that we don't have enough evidence. The problem is that we just have too many observations and people have to select what to do with that. They don't have a small study problem. Or decline effects. You may see different patterns in social sciences versus biomedical sciences, and perhaps other patterns in physical sciences. Lots of people have coalesced their efforts to try to improve the status of research practices. So the reproducibility is something that lots of people are eager to try to improve. This is one manifesto that we published 7 years ago. I can take revolution, I can take evolution if we want to improve research practices. And the balance is always how much do we emphasize the problems, that much of what we see published is wrong, is false, non-reliable, We cannot take it to the bank. We cannot activate it and use it for implementation. And how can we solve these problems and make things better? And naturally, one would think that, well, we need to solve the problems. But in my experience, what I have witnessed is that as we have moved more into solving these problems or trying to solve these problems, we generate a new literature that is not evidence-based at all and suffers from the very same biases that we were describing in the primary literature that we were trying to salvage in a way. There's opportunities and threats along the full cycle of how research is conceived, designed, executed, analyzed, written up, disseminated, and then feeding back to doing more research. And the main challenge in trying to improve all of these steps is to decide who should do what and who are really the stakeholders who have the power to intervene and really meaningfully change whatever is suboptimal. So that could include very different stakeholders. It could be scientists, it could be journals, it could be publishers, it could be institutions, it could be funding agencies or other reward systems. It could be perhaps the general public, clearly sensitized about science that would work for them and to their benefit. And perhaps we need all of those. Perhaps when we have been successful to change some practices, we had some confluence of multiple stakeholders saying that this is a good idea and we should do it. For example, registration of clinical trials was an idea that was floated many, many decades ago, but it was not getting anywhere until we had regulators, scientists, authors, trialists, journals saying that you need to do that. And, journals said, I'm not going to publish your paper unless it is registered somehow in clinicaltrials.gov or some other registry. Then it became more acceptable. Funders then said, we want you to do this. Also, regulators said that you need to register your trial. So we have multiple stakeholders pushing in the same direction. Then maybe that has the best chances of happening. At the same time, we need to try to see how we can fix the problem that most of our research is not useful. And I'm probably preaching to the choir at McMaster, but you're very well aware that most of the literature, and I'm not talking about blue sky science where you don't expect utility necessarily, you just do that and who knows what will happen. But clinical research that should be useful is not useful. And why is it not useful? Well, very often there's no problem to fix. We do research for what reason? Sometimes we even create problems that don't exist by doing that research and creating entities with overdiagnosis and expanding diagnostic criteria and making everyone sick. You look very healthy, but I'm sure that if we start looking at all the tests that you can do with whole body scans and liquid biopsies and everything, I'm sure that all of you will be very, very sick by the end of the day. Context placement is also important. Have we looked at what evidence we have already? Information gain. How much are we going to change the entropy of the system by doing yet another study? Are we really going to move the dial? Regardless of whether the results are significant or non-significant, pragmatism is that real life. If it deviates from real life, is it still relevant? Patient-centeredness, have we asked people what they care about? Or is it just our own speculations? Value for money, we have limited resources. Are we going to make the best investment? Feasibility, can we do it? Lots of clinical trials are abandoned, and most of other studies probably have more ambitious goals than can be executed. And finally, transparency of methods, data analysis, which build trust and credibility to whatever we do. Very little of that is happening across the board. If you look across all the clinical literature, very few studies have all of these criteria fulfilled. On average, maybe they fulfill one or two or none. If you decide to just read New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, BMJ, maybe a little bit better, but you're missing most of the fun because most of the interesting and useful work is not going to be in these journals that just publish a very, very tiny slice of the literature. And you're also very well aware that the quality of clinical evidence is not good when we inspect it in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. My team has looked at large collections of systematic reviews from Cochrane. That was an experience that we looked at 1,400 systematic reviews, tried to see how does the evidence overall look like if you ask for high quality for the primary outcome, statistically significant results, and a favorable interpretation. We have only 25 out of almost 1,400 reviews that we assessed that have this constellation. We have repeated that exercise recently. It looks pretty much the same. In fact, some reviews got worse in terms of their usefulness and quality, because we realized that some of the evidence that we thought maybe was credible was not credible. For example, I was involved in a Cochrane review where our latest iteration includes fewer studies than it did before, because we realized that some of the studies that had been included were probably problematic, if not outright fake and fraudulent. So if anything, the strength of the evidence became weaker and the biases became stronger over time. Now, do we radically change this evidence? For example, do we need to do mega trials for interventions? This is a paper that we published recently looking at mega trials. We tried to find every single mega trials, excluding vaccines that we could find, more than 10,000 participants, non-cluster design. We didn't find that many. And they didn't seem to disagree that much compared to smaller, and smaller sometimes was still a very big trial of just 4,000 people. But what I found most interesting is that the large majority of them had negative results. Now, does this mean that if we were to do mega trials on everything, we would have had such high failure rates, much higher failure rates compared to the classic phase 3 trial that has roughly a 75–80% success rate? Mega trials have about 20% statistical significance rate. Well, I don't know, but I would argue we need some more mega trials. Of course, we cannot do mega trials on everything, but our standards of evidence, I think, need to be very cautious about how do we calibrate what we believe and at what level, and where do we ask for more. What we do ask for more, though, is, again, reproducibility. And every scientific field is doing that, not just medicine and health sciences. When we text mine reproducibility of results, we saw a very rapid increase and uptake across papers in very diverse fields, agriculture, social sciences, psychology, neuroscience, and clinical medicine have pretty much an increase over time. Reproducibility includes different features. There's reproducibility of methods of results and of inferences. And you may have one or two or all of them or none, and one does not guarantee the others. So methods, you're all familiar with that frustration when we try to read a method section and we cannot understand what it means. So reproducibility of methods means, can you understand what the method section means? Can you go to your laptop, to your lab, to your bench, whatever the research is, and put it to work again, just reading what is described that has happened. Results reproducibility means that we do another study or 2 more studies or 5 more studies, and we try to see if the results are congruent with what the first study said. And now, interpreting whether they're congruent and compatible and similar or different, there's at least 17 methods from a statistical perspective that I'm aware of, and I'm sure that I'm missing many others. So there's even debate on what exactly we should be seeking with reproducibility of results. But the common denominator is that we're looking at multiple studies and trying to make sense of their comparative results. Reproducibility of inferences is, what do we make of this? What conclusions do we draw from as many studies as we may have? And where do we take these conclusions? Do we say that's strong evidence and we need to act and we need to do and implement that intervention in wide scale, or that's not good enough yet, or this is so weak, or this is unfavorable to do anything? And this is the weakest part. and the one that is most difficult to standardize, and perhaps there's no way to fully standardize. I think that grade teams have struggled a lot with that last step, and it is indeed the least reproducible of the reproducibility components. So how much can we improve these three aspects? The reproducibility of methods should be possible to improve. I think that's a minimum of expectation, that the method should be clear. But how exactly to do it is not that clear. And I think that even though we do see improvements in reproducibility, they happen in a very heterogeneous way in some fields, but not in others. And some of the fields that don't really care that much are those that are more massively productive. So that dark matter is expanding at a faster rate compared to the luminous matter. Reproducibility of results remains unknown in many fields, and for most papers, replication is never attempted. There's a very dominant theme in many scientific domains that trying to replicate something is me too effort, and you shouldn't waste your time. Just move on and do something different. You need to be an innovator and not go back and recheck what has been already done, which I think is usually unfortunate. You know, sometimes I have seen the opposite scenario where you have 100 studies and you have also 100 meta-analysis of the 100 studies, and you say that's enough. You don't need any more of this. But the common problem, or the most common problem, is not having replication. Finally, reproducibility of inferences, as I said, maybe it's not possible to reach 100% reproducibility of inferences. And maybe we shouldn't even push for that, because it's fine for people to disagree. It's fine for people to read the same literature and not reach the same conclusion. What I think we could improve, though, is the transparency of who are the people who disagree and perhaps why they disagree. So, for example, having transparency on conflicts, on biases, on perhaps it could be financial, but it could be non-financial. It could be activism or advocacy. I have no problem with activism, but it has to be declared that here I say this, but I'm advocating for this, and I have built that coalition where I'm just trying to take over whatever is happening in that field. We have a lot of experience to put some numbers into reproducibility aspects. For example, we have these big reproducibility check projects, like the Reproducibility Project Cancer Biology, that reported its results after more than 10 years of trying to replicate creme de la creme, very highly cited experiments in cancer biology. And the results were not good. Out of 193 papers that experiments were selected to, well, I should say 193 experiments that were selected to be reproduced, only 50 of them could be even started to see whether they can be reproduced. And the big challenge was even understanding what is going on here. So that means that the methods were not reproducible, and even reaching out to the investigators, the primary investigators, would not give us enough information to be able to launch these experiments. Those 50 that could be done, about 2/3, depending on how you read the data, perhaps a bit more, could not get the same results compared to what the original study suggested. That's not good. For some types of designs, like animal studies, the failure rate was even higher, about 80%. But what was even more problematic is how long that process took. On average, for an experiment to go to print, and I'm telling you that these are experiments that eLife was eagerly waiting to publish them, so it was not that they were delayed in review or rejections. They just went straight to very fast review and eventually publication. 197 weeks from designing an experiment that has already been done practically until getting that reproducibility published. You can think of the average PhD student who goes to the lab, first day in the lab, and the PI says, well, here's a Nature paper. Why don't you try to get your hands wet and get this up and running? just try to repeat that experiment, and that taking 197 weeks to do this. That's the whole PhD, or more than the whole PhD experience, for a single experiment that has already been done practically. People are nervous about reproducibility. It is okay when you're on the side of the critic. It is not okay when you're on the side of the person who's being criticized. And this leads to reproducibility wars. People hate to be told that their research has problems, and there's bias, and there's flaws, and there's errors, and your work is non-reproducible. I think that we need to find ways to balance the emotion and the reputation component of that, because in a very large section of that literature, we're not talking about fraud. We're not talking about people who meticulously tried to cheat. It could be honest error. It could be just that research is very difficult to do, and sometimes limited resources, or many, many other reasons. So we need to find ways that we avoid that animosity of the reproducibility wars. And unless we do that, there will be a lot of resistance to refutation. There may be resistance to refutation even if we remove the animosity, because each one of us wants to defend that what I have proposed is correct, and it is viable, and it needs to move forward, and I need to be funded again to do more of that work, and I need to be rewarded for that. So we do see resistance to refutation. We see that papers that were very highly cited, and then we had multiple randomized trials, like for the case of beta-carotene for chemoprevention of cancer. We had 6 randomized trials, large trials showing absolutely no benefit. The original observational claim that was published in Nature continued to be very heavily cited. People didn't care about the randomized trials. They were just citing the same paper that was published in Nature. It was published at the same time as other papers that got less citations after the refutation of the beta-carotene paper. The beta-carotene paper continued to be more heavily cited than the average Nature paper that was published in the same year. And we've seen that in epidemiology. We've seen it in clinical medicine. We saw it in psychology. Psychology has gone through a lot of soul searching over the last decade. So now they have multi-lab efforts where multiple teams perform multiple replications of some classic experiments. And some of them, like ego depletion, none of the replication studies finds a signal. And we have like 50 studies showing no signal for something that was a very prominent claim. People continue to cite the original claims, and they cite them as if they're true, as if they're what we know about science, and this is why we need to continue this line of research. There's many interventions that have been tried, and some of them have more rigorous evidence compared to others in terms of how they can modify research practices. I list them here from a list that I had published 10 years ago. And most of those have been tested now in a very large number of fields, mostly with favorable results. For example, team science seems to have been adopted by many fields, and it includes replication as a sine qua non in many cases. So it adopts a replication culture. Registration has made advances for clinical trials. It is being considered for many other types of designs. We have more registered protocols. We have more sharing, and I'll show you some data. We have more reproducibility checks. We have more transparency. We're not sure that it is complete on conflicts. There's a lot of debate about statistics and what are the optimal methods. I'm not sure we have made genuine progress. Many fields have improved standardization of definitions and analysis. There's a debate on how to claim success. Study design standards, the whole evidence-based movement has shifted not to reporting of research, but also design of research. And I think we have a lot of better guidance at the moment. Peer review is heavily debated on how to improve. I'm not sure we have improved it, but there's a lot of people trying to work on it. Reporting, dissemination. It's all a question of training people, training us, training everyone on what matters. And I think that there's different perspectives on what matters the most. Probably everybody agrees what data sharing should matter. So There's a lot of efforts that have tried to improve data sharing. However, when it comes to the past literature that is already out there, getting these data sets is not easy. Along with Tom Hardwick, we have started a project which we call the Data Arc, and we take the 100 most cited papers from each scientific field. We reach out to investigators. We tell them we want to curate your data for free and make them available for free for everyone to use. No need to give us any funds. We'll do all the jobs for you and make it available. Some of them made their data sets available. A few more had already done that, but the vast majority did not. And when we asked why, the key reason was that the data sets were outside of the PI's control, which means that the PI did not control the data, which in many cases, the PI had not even seen the data. In some cases of sponsor research, perhaps the sponsor had a writer who wrote the paper. They had a statistician who did the analysis, writer who wrote the paper. The PI maybe edited and put their names, but they never really saw the machinery of the work that carries their name and their accountability. And of course, there are efforts like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors asking for data statements routinely for every paper. So one has to say, what are you going to do with the data sets from that paper? So we went to see what is happening for clinical trials in Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA for the first 3 years of that policy, about 500 trials. Yes, most of those had some declaration that they would make the clinical trial data available. Individual participant data, about half of them. Specific repository, about 20%. If you were asking for de-identified individual participant data on a specific repository, very, very few. And if you wanted the data sets tonight, that was only 2 papers actually from the same trial out of about 500 papers that we examined. Many of these papers made promises that later, mañana, ask us again in a year, or is an embargo now. So we did try to see what happened 3 years later, what happened to all these embargoes. Some of them had been lifted, some of them had not. Some of them were never specified, in fact, how long they would be. So who knows when they might become available. And there were a few more data sets that you could get a hold of right away, but the vast majority, they were not available promptly to be used. BMJ and PLOS Medicine are examples of journals that have been more aggressive with their policies of sharing. So for a number of years, they have specified that I don't want a data sharing statement only, but I want you to promise that if you are asked to give your raw data sets, you will give them to whoever is asking. This is like a precondition for publication of a clinical trial. And actually, BMJ several months ago did the same thing, or said we're doing the same thing for practically anything that comes to our desk, not just clinical trials. So we did go to the PIs of clinical trials that had been published in these 2 journals, and we said we want to take a look at the data and rerun the analysis. It's a little bit like getting an audit from the tax agency. But nevertheless, about half of them did send the data sets, and when we rerun the analysis, we found the same results. Very minor differences occasionally. None of them would affect the main inferences and conclusions of the paper. So I think that means that in an environment where all the stakeholders are aligned and they want to be responsible, sharing, transparent, you can trust pretty much what you read. And some fields have been doing this for quite a while. For example, genetics and genomics, many subdisciplines have a culture of data sharing everything. 5 years ago, we published that paper in Science where we said people should share even before publishing their own results, because publishing their little slice of results may be misleading. It's really the whole conglomerate of all the evidence that matters. And of course, everyone should get credit for what data sets they have produced and what they have done, but try to get everything in public sharing mode and give credit to everyone for a composite analysis. And we have observatory type of surveys where we map the entire biomedical literature over time based on text mining algorithms that we have tried to validate. And I think they work pretty well, at least for biomedicine. We're trying to expand them also in other scientific fields. We see that there has been improvement in sharing over time. For example, back in 2000, less than 1 in 100 papers would share their raw data sets. Now it has stabilized at about 20%. Good news. The bad news is that it doesn't seem to be getting better than 20%. And since the mid 2010s, it stayed at about 20%. And I'm not sure whether we can push much further. Code sharing is at about 5%. Protocol sharing is at about 7%. More replications, or at least knowledge replications, are happening. And there are placeholders for disclosures of conflicts and for disclosures of funding practically in almost every single paper. We just don't know whether they're complete or not. If you map these practices across the universe of science in these maps that I showed you earlier, you see that they're happening in different areas of the scientific endeavor. So data sharing is happening in some fields, and a subset of them is also sharing code. Protocol registration happens mostly in different fields. So having the triplet, data, code, and protocols, is pretty uncommon. Funding, disclosures, and conflicts of interest, there's placeholders everywhere. Open access has become very common. I blame myself for being an early proponent of open access because I thought that meant open science, and I fought for that, and now I feel like a fool because now open access means just more money for the publishers with article processing fees. But yeah, one has to be very, very careful what exactly we ask for, because eventually we get something that has the same name, but not really what we meant. As research is becoming more complex, we need also to revisit our reproducibility of computational methods. And there are guidelines on how to improve reproducibility of computational methods, like these guidelines that we had published in Science in 2016. We are struggling on that domain. I think many people who work with very complex methods realize that they need to do this. The pandemic was a mixed experience. We've published a few empirical assessments of models in infectious diseases and in epidemiology. There's some modeling, complex modeling, that is very transparent and hopefully very reproducible. There's lots of other papers that are not transparent at all, and most you cannot even tell whether they're reproducible or not. There's a trade-off between transparency and complexity. More complex science is by default less transparent unless we do something about it, and we could do something about it. So, for example, even for artificial intelligence, deep neural networks, we have published recommendations on what to do and what are the resources that you can make research more transparent and more reproducible. With large language models, things are going to become more messy. In a way, large language models are by definition non-reproducible because every moment they train on a different data set. They're continuously fed with new information. So what they tell you this morning may not be the same as what they tell you by the end of the day, especially there's a big chunk of information that has been included. So we need to work around that. Do we make a difference? Well, that's the holy grail question. This is a very nice paper published in Nature Human Behavior that showed that high replicability of newly discovered social behavioral findings is achievable. The investigators did a very large number of studies in social behavioral research that has a very poor record of reproducibility. It said when we followed registration and careful research practices, we could get a very high, close to 90% replication. Well, the problem is that the paper was retracted. Why? Well, because it was realized that they had not followed registration and all of these careful research practices that they promised. And the goal of the paper was entirely different. These studies had not been registered. The analysis was entirely exploratory and kind of an incidental finding in a way. So non-evidence-based solutions may even be harmful. They may give us a sense that oh, we have done so great, and you should buy, what John Ioannidis is saying, data sharing and register and reproducibility checks and everything. All of that comes with some cost, with some potential harms, with some trade-off of benefits and risks. And I think we should not shortchange the sequence of assessing our interventions. Research practice indicators are surrogates. Think of clinical medicine where you have a biomarker versus death. Data sharing is great, very nice. It's like having a very nice biomarker reading. It doesn't mean that you will live longer. So we have to prove also that our literature lives longer and it is more reliable and it does make a positive impact. These markers are not the end goal of research. They're tools that we want to use to improve our chances of making a positive difference by doing research. And I think that we have to use all the tools available to try to understand how to do that best. But here's one in silico model of science where we use with David Grimes 11 equations to create a universe of science in silico. It includes 3 types of researchers: the diligent ones, the sloppy ones, and the fraudulent ones. How is the representation of each sector? It's hard to tell, but if you ask researchers, are you sloppy? The answer is always no. If you ask, are people sloppy in your immediate environment? The answer is almost always yes. But we assume that very few scientists are fraudulent. Some are sloppy and the majority are diligent. We run that in silico universe through a number of reward cycles with funding. If you do something, you publish, you get funding, you get progeny also of younger researchers who follow your standards. We see that the sloppy and the fraudulent take over. Why? Well, because they have an evolutionary advantage. They can get the same reward by doing less if they're sloppy, or by doing nothing if they're completely fake and fraudulent. So we have to find ways to, if not penalize the sloppy and the fraudulent, at least reward those who are diligent. How to do that? Our whole reward system needs to be reevaluated, reassessed with a clear mind, with clear goals. Our peer review standards need to be assessed. There's a huge agenda of research and peer review. For those who might be interested, you're welcome to join us in Chicago in September for our next iteration of the peer review and scientific publication meeting. And eventually, we should not give up. I think we've come a long way. I think the surrounding discussion on how to improve research practices is intense. It will continue to be intense. There may be even a ceiling of what we should expect, maybe for some types of research and some types of designs. If we are 5% correct, that's pretty good, because currently we're 1%, and maybe the best we can get is 5%. Perfection is unattainable, but improvements are possible. Reproducibility indicators, as I said, are surrogates, and what matters in research science and its positive impact is more complex. And beware that there's new stakeholders out there. There's big tech, there's lots of entrepreneurs, lots of venture capitalists who are absorbing science in ways that are non-transparent, that feed into the dark matter and the dark energy. And even the ways that we appraise, publish, disseminate, understand science may change very rapidly in the near future. So I hope I left enough time for questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, that's all.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting and excellent presentation, mind you. The whole point of science is fallibility. And science embraces fallibility. We know that fallibility is going to happen all the time. And in fact, your whole career is about pointing out fallibility, and that is good. So I think that is excellent. My question really is a lot about the focus on reproducibility, because we can reproduce bad science very easily. You can do observational research and keep finding that breathing kills you, or like observational type things. But should the focus be more on on pushing the right sorts of methodologies and not, you know, necessarily reproducibility, because 10 papers that say
Yeah.
the same thing with a bad method is not as good as 1 or 2 that show something with a more reliable method. So I just find it.
Absolutely. That's a very fair point. And
You want to repeat the question for those who are online?
yes. So the question is whether we should not necessarily focus that much on reproducing poor or weak research designs that may be unreliable, and maybe we reproduce them and find the same results, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they're correct, but push more towards better, more credible, more rigorous designs that might give us a much better answer. And I agree. And this is why I have been skeptical about how much we want to push for replication. I think I don't expect that everything has to be replicated. I think that if we have the option at no cost and with better efficiency to include replication in the discovery process, this is a good idea. And sometimes it's just normal to do, like, for example, in all these large consortia where you have multiple teams joining forces, you have replication by default because it is there. You have 50 teams that do the same thing. Actually, they don't do anything. They have the data sets available already. So why not use it? But replicating every little tiny, dirty, observational, biased piece of data collection probably doesn't make sense. Maybe indeed you need to push more for a higher level of evidence, a higher standard, and then try to replicate. So where exactly to do that, I think it varies from one field to another. And as I mentioned, for some types of designs and some types of fields, maybe 5% being correct is amazing performance. And we should just calibrate ourselves to say that 5% is what we're aiming for.
All right, then I just let one question because we have people waiting.
Whether we should open the door more and more people to know about the dark matter. And the reason I'm saying that is because there is always the risk of people like getting a little bit intimidated or feeling that there is a chance that science can be discarded. But if we close that and try to conceal that, is the risk higher for people, including mass media, to discard the science anyway, as it happens with politics, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the dark matter is dark, so that's the problem with it. But it is real, and I think that there's new waves of dark matter. For example, with artificial intelligence, universities are completely outpaced compared to big tech, and big tech does not care about publishing what they do, and they can literally do work that corresponds to millions of papers just overnight. And none of that may come forth. Or even worse, sometimes they may make some of that, of these resources open source, like some of the big LLMs that are widely popularized, but that just means that they absorb whatever luminous matter exists for their own dark matter purposes. So this is why I say that we have all these new stakeholders that are shaping an environment that we don't really know exactly what is happening in different sectors of science. But if anything, to me, that means that we need to defend at least what is visible and try to push for some regulation that we could make more of that hidden part available, or at least transparent in some ways that we can understand what's happening and where we stand.
All right, well, unfortunately, there's people waiting to use this classroom, so we have to call it quits here. I know that people online would like to say a few words, but you have John's contact information. I hope you're okay if people send you an email with a question. Please, let's thank John again for an exciting presentation.
Thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thanks, sir. Yeah.